Come with me on a journey back in time. We're headed back into the dark recesses of human history. The date is the 12th of October, 539 BC. Daniel 5 is our manuscript, a chapter that describes for us the end of an empire. Ezekiel 18 verse 20 declares, "The soul who sins shall die." This chapter of Daniel is a practical demonstration of this verse. This declaration from Ezekiel is true both of an individual, but also for a nation. Nebuchadnezzar, the king we've been looking at in the first 4 chapters of Daniel, has been dead for 23 years. Nabonidus, Nebuchadnezzar's son by marriage, seized control of Babylon a few years after Nebuchadnezzar's death. Nabonidus loved to go on extended military campaigns, and during these adventures he left his son in charge. His son, Belshazzar, the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, is now running the kingdom. The city of Babylon at this time was considered impenetrable. As we begin this chapter, the Medes Persian army has surrounded the city of Babylon with a massive force of arms. Belshazzar paid no attention to the enemy at his gates. Why should he? When Herodotus, a Greek historian, stated these staggering facts about the Babylonian defensive walls. They were 90 kilometres in length, arrayed in 3 outer rings of defence. These walls were, at their highest, 97 metres. At their thickest, they were 24 metres wide. There were 250 fortress towers built into these walls where soldiers were permanently garrisoned. Plus, the city was located on the banks of a man-made tributary of the Euphrates River, which the Babylonians had used to create an additional moat defence around the city. Tradition was the city of Babylon was built upon the legendary site of the ruined Tower of Babel, spoken of in Genesis 11. The city was stocked with 20 years' worth of supplies. Babylon was invincible. The Medes and Persians can never get in. From a human perspective, Belshazzar had no reason to be concerned about the massive army outside his city walls. So what did he do to prove that he wasn't worried? Reading from chapter 5 verse 1, Belshazzar the king made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in the presence of the 1,000. Why should I trouble myself with amassing armies outside my walls? Belshazzar probably thought. They can't get over or under or through our walls. So he put on a party to prove that he wasn't worried. The specific mention of drinking wine suggests a drunken quagmire of humanity at this great party. While he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple, which had been in Jerusalem, that the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines. Now it says his father Nebuchadnezzar. It was in our terms actually his grandfather. The Aramaic word translated as father literally means ancestor. Nonetheless, the Hebrew tradition, if you had a famous ancestor, you'd call them your father no matter how many generations before. The presence of women at this party was not the normal cultural standard either. The men had feasts together, separate from the women. The fact that the men and women appeared to be together suggests this may have been a drunken orgy. By this time in the party, everyone is completely drunk. They were using alcohol to help them forget their problems. Many people today use alcohol the same way. I've heard people say, I have a glass of wine or 2 with dinner. It helps me relax and unwind after a stressful day. Sounds more like you might have a problem with alcohol to me, especially if the glass or 2 is really a bottle every night. Alcohol will not help solve your problems. It'll much more likely get you into bigger problems. The king, in his drunken stupor, comes up with a very bad idea. Alcohol and bad ideas are common bedfellows. Let's go get those fancy, holy Hebrew ceremonial cups. There was no one around bold enough or wise enough to contradict Belshazzar. Verse 3. Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken from the temple of the house of God, which had been in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the God of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone. If you've never read this history before, you know this isn't going to end well. You just don't mock and blaspheme God like this and think there'll be no consequences. The holy vessels of God being abused and people abusing them, praising false gods whilst drinking from them. The people were getting looser and looser and coarser and coarser. In the same hour, the fingers of a man's hand appeared and rode opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, and the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Like a bolt of lightning, a hand appeared, apparently out of nowhere, and just starts writing on the wall. In these ancient times, it was very common to include on the walls of the royal courts details of your or your ancestors' military conquests and achievements. These royal walls were propaganda tools. This handwriting probably just blotted out the boastful achievements it overlaid, whilst cries of terror and gasps of fear exhaled from the mouths of the 1,000 nobles. A moment of true shock and awe. Verse 6, and the king's countenance changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his hips were loosed, and his knees knocked against each other. The Bible, in very delicate and euphemistic fashion, is telling us Belshazzar literally pooed his pants right where he stood in front of the entire party. And in that moment, he became instantly sober. This drunken orgy is over. The air, no doubt, became decidedly thick, and the king's knees knocked together. On the future day, the great white throne judgment described in Revelation 20 will see billions of people white with fright as they fall before Jesus, and he pronounces their eternal doom. This Daniel is seen as a preliminary sample to all warning of the dangers of living a life of defiance against God. Verse 7, the king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. The king spoke, saying to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and tells me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and he shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Why the third ruler? Because Nabonidus was the first and Belshazzar was the second. The language used is very precise. It's unlikely someone who wasn't aware of the local political realities would have known this detail. Until the early 20th century, secular historians scoffed at this Belshazzar reference, as he was unknown in secular records. But relatively recent archaeological discoveries have subsequently confirmed the Daniel account is 100% correct. Notice also who the king turns to for spiritual advice: the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. This is a 2,500-year-old historical story, but people haven't changed much since then. People still read their star signs. They turn to their self-help gurus and life coaches. Don't waste your time. Turn straight to God and his holy word. The worldly types can't read the signs of the times, but those filled with the Holy Spirit can see things clearly, just like Daniel. The writing's on the wall, and God's time of judgment is just around the corner. Verse 8, now all the king's wise men came, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king its interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly troubled. His countenance was changed, and his lords were astonished. This is the third time in the book of Daniel that the Babylonian wise men couldn't help the ruler. These type of worldly wise men are still around today, attempting to explain the supernatural from the natural perspective. Professing to be wise, they became fools. When you're dealing with spiritual matters, the wisdom of the world is totally useless. The natural man does not receive the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness to him. Verse 10. The queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came to the banquet hall. The queen spoke, saying, O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts trouble you, nor let your countenance change. Who is this queen? She is likely the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar, the wife of Nabonidus, the mother of Belshazzar. She's been around a lot longer than her son. She's also had to deal with plenty of Belshazzar's dirty nappies. Sometimes younger people can believe their parents don't know very much. Parents usually know a lot more than their children. Young people would be wise to listen to their parents' advice. Why wasn't the queen at this banquet? If you'll allow me to speculate, as the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar, perhaps her father's experiences with God had impacted her life also. She knew better than to be involved in this drunken party, where the holy articles of God were being blasphemed. Sometimes parents have already made similar mistakes that they can see their children about to make. Verse 11. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the Spirit of the Holy God. And in the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father, or ancestor, your father, the king, made him chief of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. There is a man in your kingdom, in whom is the Spirit of the Holy God. She's quoting her father Nebuchadnezzar verbatim. Daniel's the man you need. Over the last 20 years, Daniel has been removed from his former prominent position as leader of the magicians. Perhaps internal Babylonian politics, with the changing of the rulers, came younger men with new ideas. Whatever the reason, Daniel had been pushed aside. And during this sidelining, God revealed at least two incredible visions to Daniel. By this time, Daniel had already seen the visions of chapter 7 and 8. That gave Daniel a detailed insight of the coming Medes Persians. Inasmuch as an excellent spirit, knowledge, understanding, interpreting dreams, solving riddles, and explaining enigmas were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar, now let Daniel be called, and he will give the interpretation. Mothers don't have all the answers, but they'll have many of them. And I bet most of the time they'll be wise enough to know who to go to get the right answers when they don't know the answers, especially if they're godly women. The expression explaining enigmas literally also means untying knots. You give Daniel a big jumbled pile of knots and he'll straighten it out. He'll tidy things up, son. Verse 13, then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king spoke and said to Daniel, are you that Daniel, who is one of the captives from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah? I've heard of you, that the Spirit of God is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. All the wise men have failed. Now in strides the magnificent prophet. He's set apart as God's man. It's so comfortable to be hidden within a crowd. But it's when we stand out from the crowd as different, God's man or God's woman, that we usually have the chance to bring glory to God. There's no way Daniel would be part of the wise rabble that came in before him. He strides in on his own like a colossus. He's now in his 80s. He's happy to stand alone. His past displays of brilliance, now almost forgotten, mythic, spoken of in hushed whispers by the older wise men. It may have been 20 years since Daniel was called to give advice to the king. In the opening 2 chapters, It was Daniel, the young man before the older king. Now it's Daniel, a much older, grey-haired man brought in before this less experienced ruler. There might be some people listening to me today wondering why God isn't using them. Daniel was sidelined, it appears, for many years. But the moment he's called on, he's instantly ready to be God's mouthpiece. If you feel like you could be more useful in God's service, be ready like Daniel. You never know when God is going to call on you. Verse 15, now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing and make known to me its interpretation. But they could not give the interpretation of the thing. And I have heard of you, that you can give interpretations and explain enigmas. You can untie complex knots. Now, if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple, a royal colour, and have a chain of gold around your neck, and it shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. There's something different about Daniel. He emanates a sense of confidence and self-assuredness, but without the slightest hint of pride. If you're observant, you might also have noticed his Babylonian name is more or less now discarded. Everyone's calling him Daniel, a name meaning Elohim is my judge. The younger wise men probably thought nothing but echoes of past glory. Surely his reputation's inflated. He can't be as brilliant as the tales make him out to be. Daniel's probably thinking, why would I want to be third ruler in a kingdom that's about to end? Verse 17, then Daniel answered and said before the king, let your gifts be for yourself and give your rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. The moment Daniel opens his mouth, all doubts about his past legends dissipate. I wish some of today's televangelists would take their lead from Daniel. Keep your dirty money and your rewards for yourself. I don't serve God for money. I speak the truth from God for free. Daniel was filled with a holy zeal. He was a man who couldn't be bought, bribed, or frightened off. He was a man of absolute integrity, a characteristic often hated by the compromised elites of the world's ruling class. O King, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar, your father or ancestor, a kingdom of and majesty, glory and honour. And because of the majesty that he gave him, all peoples, nations and languages trembled and feared before him. Whomever he wished, he executed. Whomever he wished, he kept alive. Whomever he wished, he set up. Whomever he wished, he put down. Nebuchadnezzar had absolute power. He was the head of gold from chapter 2. None of the other rulers in the Persian, Greek or Roman kingdoms wielded Nebuchadnezzar's level of total authority. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. Then he was driven from the sons of men, his heart was made like the beasts, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God rules in the kingdom of men and appoints over it whomever he wishes, or whomever he chooses. Daniel has just recounted the events of chapter 4 that took place over 2 decades earlier. He's also building God's brief of evidence against Belshazzar. Verse 22, but you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all this, and you have lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven. They have brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your lords, your wives and your concubines have drunk from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, bronze and iron, wood and stone, which do not see or hear or know. The God who holds your breath in his hand and owns all your ways, you have not glorified. What's most frightening about this pronouncement was that the king flagrantly sinned in the face of knowledge. A simple Bible principle is that light creates responsibility. He was not sinning in ignorance, he was doing so willfully. This king knew what he was doing, and how he was living was wrong. There are those today that know of what Jesus has done for them, and they trample on that knowledge. They sin against light, and their judgment from God will be that much harsher. Then the fingers of the hand were sent from him, and this writing was written. And this is the inscription that was written: Mene Tekel Upharsin. It's not completely certain why the wise men couldn't read this. Remember, these wise men are highly educated. Perhaps God blinded them or wrote in a coded format that only Daniel could decipher. This is the interpretation of each word. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. To put this another way, let's refer back to the multi-metallic dream of King Nebuchadnezzar back in chapter 2. The time of the head of gold is finished. The time of the silver chest and arms is upon us. God told your grandfather the future, and that future's now. The debauched state of Babylon now demands that God ends this kingdom. A kingdom or country can reach such a rotten state that God is forced to judge and even destroy that nation. Societies usually crumble from within. If you study history's great kingdoms, you'll see often dramatic rises to power, followed by a period of expansion, pride, stagnation, moral corruption, leading to decline. Sometimes swift, sometimes a slow decay. But the doom of a nation or kingdom is spelled when it forgets God. Mene, Belshazzar, your number's up. He says it twice for emphasis. Mene, Mene, you're finished. Tekel, you're a lightweight. The accounts are due and you've come in short. You've fallen short of the glory of God. Perez, which is a simple form of Upharsin. You're broken. You're divided. The Medes and Persians are carving up your kingdom as we speak. On that very night, the 12th of October, 539 BC, the head of gold is done. It's time for the chest and arms of silver to take over. The Hebrew prophet Jeremiah, many decades earlier, had prophesied the following: And now I've given all these lands into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant, and the beasts of the field I've also given him to serve him. So all nations shall serve him and his son and his son's son until the time of his land comes. The grandson of Nebuchadnezzar is ruling just as Jeremiah predicted, and the handwriting's on the wall. Time's up. God has often given people of every age a glimpse into their future. He told the Jews they would go into captivity for 70 years, then return to the land of promise. He told Israel when their much longed for Messiah would come, and then how and why he would be killed. God scores 100% on prophecy because God knows the end from the beginning. He's outside our time domain. The future is set in stone, and God has laid out many of his plans in advance for us to read and study. This pagan king was so busy getting drunk and having wild parties. He was too busy doing those things to investigate what God had predicted in his future. Verse 29, then Belshazzar gave the command, and they clothed Daniel with purple, put a chain of gold around his neck, and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. While the party was going on, while the hand was writing on the wall, while the king was defecating in his pants, while the queen was schooling her son, while Daniel was pronouncing the doom of an empire. The Medes and the Persians were pulling off a brilliant engineering feat and had diverted the Euphrates River. The defensive moat was the critical outer layer of Babylon's defence. With the Euphrates redirected, Babylon's underbelly was exposed. The Medo-Persian army walked into Babylon without opposition via the drains that supplied fresh water to the city. As we draw this study to a close, I'd like to focus briefly on the king of the Persians, a man named Cyrus, not mentioned in this passage. This man Cyrus the Great, was specifically predicted by name nearly 200 years earlier by the prophet Isaiah. Josephus records when Cyrus made his grand entrance into Babylon, the now ruler of the city, Daniel, was there to greet him and presented him with a scroll of Isaiah, pointing out to him these very words addressed directly to him from this ancient scroll. Be dry, and I will dry up your rivers. That's exactly what Cyrus has just done. Who says of Cyrus? God addresses Cyrus by name long before he was even born. He is my servant, and he shall perform all my pleasure, saying to Jerusalem, you shall be built, and to the temple, your foundation shall be laid. Thus says the Lord to his anointed. That's not a word Hebrews usually use for Gentiles. He said to his anointed, to Cyrus, again mentioned by name, whose right hand I have held, to subdue nations before him, and loose the armour, or better, the loins of kings. No doubt rumours of Belshazzar's recent accident have been told to Cyrus to open before him the double doors, so that the gates will not be shut. His army had just walked into an impregnable city. I will go before you and make the crooked places straight. I will break in pieces the gates of bronze and cut the bars of iron. For Jacob, my servant's sake, and Israel, my elect, I have even called you by your name. I have named you Cyrus. Cyrus was so impressed that he freed the Jewish captives to return to Judah, ending their 70 years of captivity, as Jeremiah had predicted. He issued a decree to rebuild the temple at Jerusalem, just as Isaiah predicted he would. When God's ready to move, get out of the way. He can make the impossible happen in the blink of an eye. Babylon was impregnable, but not for God. And it was his time then to fulfill multiple prophecies. God knows your future. He knows our collective future. This book is exciting. It's full of predictions of our future. When the Holy Spirit starts revealing truth from God, it's invigorating, it's life transforming. Don't waste your life on worldly pursuits like gathering possessions or power. Don't be focused on carnal things. If you're living like this, one day without warning, God may say to you, Mene Tekel Upharsin, and it'll be too late. Rather decide to live for God and serve Jesus, and you won't want to waste your time on carnal pursuits. Mene. Time's up for my sermon today.